Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson. Tonight, we want to begin this evening with the story of Mike the Headless Chicken. It sounds implausible, but it really happened, and it tells you something. It begins this way. One afternoon in the fall of 1945, a farmer in western Colorado called Lloyd Olson walked into the barnyard to get dinner. His wife said she wanted some chicken, so Olson found a 5-month-old bird called Mike and then beheaded it with a hatchet. But then a funny thing happened. Mike didn't die. In fact, Mike lived another full year and a half. He lived long enough to become a traveling sideshow attraction before he ultimately choked to death in a motel room in Phoenix, a sad story. But the question is, how did Mike live for 18 months without a head? Well, scientists had a number of explanations for how he did it, but the real reason is simple. Mike had no idea he'd been killed, so he just kept going. Mike was too dumb to die. Something very similar just happened in the Russia investigation this week. For 2 years, we've been told that there was some form of collusion between the Russian government and the 2016 Trump campaign. Details were sketchy, so we paid for an independent counsel and a number of congressional investigations to find out exactly what happened. Then last week, Democrats hit pay dirt. They produced the perfect witness, the one man in America who would know exactly what happened between the Trump campaign and Russia, Michael Cohen. Michael Cohen was Donald Trump's personal lawyer for 10 years. Communications between Trump and Cohen were supposed to be privileged and protected, so Trump would have been free to tell Cohen anything and everything. If there's one person who would know firsthand about Russian collusion in all its detail, it's Michael Cohen. And if there's one person who'd be happy to tell Congress about Russian collusion in all its detail, it's also Michael Cohen. Michael Cohen hates Trump. He has said so repeatedly and vehemently. So last week, Democrats on Capitol Hill put Cohen under oath and asked him about Russian collusion. Here's what happened next.
Based on what you know, would Mr. Trump, or did he, lie about colluding and coordinating with the Russians at any point during the campaign?
So as I stated in my testimony, I wouldn't use the word colluding.
There you have it. Michael Cohen says there was no collusion with Russia. That is the final word. After 2 years, the most far-fetched spy story in American history ends abruptly. The Russia conspiracy is dead, killed with hatchet-on-stump finality on live television. But here's the twist. Nobody in Washington seemed to notice. They have no idea what just happened. Like Mike the Headless Chicken, they're still running around, bumping into things. In fact, they're still issuing subpoenas. Yesterday, the House Judiciary Committee sent out at least 81 of them. The subpoenas are aimed at individuals, organizations, and government agencies that might have damaging information about Donald Trump. Information that, for some reason, a reason nobody can explain, his personal attorney of 10 years did not have. Apparently, it's extra double secret information. If this all seems a little nuts, prepare yourself. We learned on CNN yesterday that it's simply the beginning.
In addition to the 81 names of entities and individuals released today, do you expect more?
Yes. In short order, there will be additional names, additional document requests that are made in the coming days.
Additional names, additional document requests. If you had to sum up the entire Democratic platform, those two sentences would do it. More subpoenas! Vote for us! We'll investigate! At some point, though, it's easy to lose track of what all these investigations are about. Can you remember? Search your memory for a moment. Last week, it was Russian collusion, the hacking of our democracy by Vladimir Putin, unseen saboteurs. This week, every bit as solemnly, it's obstruction of justice.
You say the president, has obstructed justice. You've been clear about that. But you said yesterday...
There's certainly a lot of evidence that he has, but that's exactly the kind of thing we have to look into.
Okay, so now you're not sure he's obstructed justice?
Personally, I think he has, but we have to look and see.
But the reason I ask is obviously if he obstructed justice, that's a crime. It's an impeachable act. You don't have to have a crime to be impeachable, but a crime is an impeachable act.
Not every crime is an impeachable act. That one would be.
That one would be. Okay.
So what are they telling us? Well, you can see what they're telling us. Impeachment's coming. And of course it is. Democratic leaders have assured us again and again they have no plans to impeach, but they're lying. Their voters demand impeachment. So really they have no choice. In some ways, an impeachment trial would be an upgrade from the creepy, secretive process we have now. Shadowy intelligence agencies won't be spying on anyone during an impeachment trial. Federal agents won't be rousting anyone from bed at rifle point. Impeachment is a public and fairly transparent process. We can watch it on television. We can assess for ourselves what we think of Jerry Nadler and his friends. Best of luck to Democrats on that. But take 3 steps back. What's the cost of all of this to the rest of the country? Well, it's hard to assess that, really, but a story in the paper this morning does give you some hint of it. It's this. In 2017, the combined death rates from alcohol, drugs, and suicide in this country hit their highest recorded levels ever since record keeping began. But you know this if you live here. If you haven't been to the funeral of someone who's died from booze, drugs, or suicide lately, count yourself lucky, because they're everywhere. The surreal thing is that nobody on television ever mentions any of this. It's like it's not even happening. Maybe that's because in their world, it isn't happening. Everything is fine where they live. People there are prosperous and secure and happy, and they plan on staying that way. They resent any attempt to remind them that in the world beyond the coastal cities, America is killing itself. That means the people who built this country are dying. The people in charge of this country are ignoring them as they die. You've got to wonder how long this can continue. It's too frivolous. It's too dishonest. They keep telling us the only thing that matters is Trump. They know that isn't true. They just don't want to talk about the rest of it because they're implicated in it. Rochelle Ritchie is a former press secretary for the House Democratic Policy and Communications Committee, and she's nice enough to join us tonight. Rochelle, thanks a lot for coming on.
Hi, Tucker.
So not to pull back the frame too far, but I see this story in USA Today this morning saying the death rates from alcohol, drugs, and suicide are the highest ever measured in this country. That seems like a huge story to me. And I'm not just blaming Democrats, but I can't think of a single political figure who mentioned that today. How could they miss that?
You know, I think that both sides have missed that, and it is a huge problem in our country, but I don't think that it's necessarily something that we can say is taking away from us focusing, like the Mueller investigation is not necessarily taking away from our opportunity to focus on drugs and alcohol addiction. I mean, for instance,
Really?
I live in New York City, and I can tell you that Governor Cuomo just last month put forth $7.5 million to fight drug and alcohol addiction, and then last summer he put forward a program that was about $4 million to address suicides. So I think that Democrats are focusing on this.
I don't know if you're intentionally mocking him or not. $7.5 million for drugs and alcohol. It's one of the biggest killers in the state of New York. And $4 million.
It's a grant. It's a grant to improve the services.
We spend more on homeless shelters per month in the borough of Staten Island than he's spending the entire state on some of the biggest killers in the state. So what you just did is indict him, I think, in a pretty vicious way. I don't know if those numbers are right, but if they are, he should be ashamed.
They are right. $7.5 million, and that's what he's investing into programs that already exist.
It's embarrassing. It's embarrassing what you just said. But let me ask you, and look, they're not mutually exclusive. You can have a Mueller investigation and still talk about the fact the middle of the country is dying. But we're not talking about it at all, and all we're talking about is Trump. And I just wonder at a certain point, like, how much of that is a distraction?
It's honestly not a distraction. Look, I think that we cannot necessarily say, I heard your monologue in the beginning, and I don't think that we can necessarily say that, you know, Democrats want to see him impeached. If you look at the Quinnipiac poll that just came out, 59% of the country does not support starting the process of impeachment.
Right.
That's a good sign for Republicans, and that's sort of a sign to Democrats that, look, you can't just ride this we hate Trump train and think that people are going to support you as far as an impeachment. There has to be a political process, and that's why Nadler said in that in an interview with George Stephanopoulos, where he said, look, we have to persuade the American people. We have to prove and provide evidence for impeachment.
I got it. Look, and there are things about the president I wouldn't defend. It's not my job. He doesn't pay me, okay? But you got to kind of wonder after, you know, the entire first half of his first term completely taken over by these investigations from all kinds of directions. Republicans played a role in them as well. And there's nothing. There's not one actionable charge. There's not one indictment on any of these charges of anybody, any American.
Tucker, there's been indictments.
Nobody's been indicted for betraying the country or for obstructing justice.
Cohen, they haven't been indicted. Yes, they absolutely have. Now, the president has not been indicted.
Okay. Look, let's be totally real. I'm not, Paul Manafort, he wasn't my accountant, thank God. But nothing Manafort did, not registering under fair, cheating on his taxes. I mean, that's bad. I'm not here to defend it, but I'm telling you, when you shut down the entire federal government for 2 years and that's what you get, can you really look in the camera and say, yeah, it was worth it?
I don't think that the federal government has been shut down for 2 years. What we did see happen is the federal government shut down over a border wall. That we did see.
Okay,
but as far as it's being shut down for the Mueller investigation is not true.
But that's a real question. Like, we have higher illegal immigration rates now than we did in January of last year. Like, there are a lot of people coming across the border. Now, maybe you think that's great, maybe you don't, but that's a real conversation.
Illegal immigration has actually decreased.
No, that's not true. That's a talking point. Update your talking points. That's not true. But let me just ask you this. Can you look at the Michael Cohen tape where he says to Debbie Wasserman Schultz, no collusion? What do you make of that? No, I'm serious. What do you make of that?
No, what I make of it is that it's so funny because you have Republicans that come out and say, "Oh, you can't believe Cohen. He's a liar. He's going to jail for."
I'm not saying that. I'm asking you what you think of that.
I didn't say you. I said Republicans. I'm going to tell you what I think.
There are a lot of silly Republicans out there.
But this is the point. They're questioning Cohen's credibility. But then when it comes to this point of, oh, there was no collusion, then it's like, oh yeah, believe Cohen.
I get it. But I'm not here to take credit for some dumb House Republican. I'm asking an honest question on behalf of our viewers. Michael Cohen would know if there was collusion. We both agree on that. He has no reason to pretend there wasn't. Asked directly, he said there wasn't, and we're pretending that didn't happen. So if Michael Cohen knows of no collusion, then what are we doing here exactly?
Well, Tucker, what he did say during that testimony, however, is that he was in the room when Roger Stone called President Trump and told him that Assange had information from WikiLeaks that they were going to dump Hillary Clinton's emails.
I mean, what? I mean,
everybody
huge. I know. Okay,
that's a huge point. And he was working with Felix. He was working with Felix Sater on the deal. He said that Felix Sater had an office on the 26th floor of Trump Tower. So clearly there was some sort of collusion going on. I don't think I'm going to get you to answer that question. Okay, Rochelle, I appreciate it, though. Thank you for coming on. Thanks for having me.